Now I have the pleasure of introducing Vicki Boardman. Vicki Boardman was in the Pratt and Venice program of '07 as well. She's an artist and graphic designer who attended the program in 2007, graduated from Pratt with a dual degree of the MFA and the Master's in Theory, Criticism, and History of Art, Design, and Architecture in 2010. Following her interest in the materials and techniques class, she had the opportunity to assist Eleonora Del Federico, I hope she's here, in art conservation science research, performing non-destructive spectroscopy on site in Volterra and Herculaneum in Italy. I think quite a few of you are familiar with this work that Eleonora does. She's a wonderful collaborator and colleague. Vicki's research on wall paintings and mosaics has been published in the Journal of Bioanalytical Chemistry and presented at meetings of the American Chemical Society and several Pratt symposia on chemistry and art. Vicki's current work and research focuses on ecology, feminism, which entered her thesis as well, depictions of spirituality and consciousness through nature. Welcome, Vicki.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm going to start screen sharing. Okay. I'm thrilled to be part of such a great event, and I want to thank everyone who put such care and dedication into organizing it. So I've always been a giant plant nerd, and I come by it honestly. As a little girl visiting my grandmother in Hawaii, we would stop whatever we were doing to check out some random bromeliad we didn't recognize. We would memorize enough details about it to look it up when we got home, and inevitably we declared our new favorite plant. During the Pratt and Venice summer program, I was delighted to see many new plants. There was an oleander growing outside my studio window, 6-foot-high lavender bushes, and certain wildflowers that I still love to draw. But the most fascinating plants were the ones I already knew, those I remembered that had medicinal properties, which were curiously located in the cycle of Renaissance paintings. Serendipitously, my first extended viewing of Carpaccio's cycle of paintings for the Scuola di Sant'Orsola directly followed a musical and dance performance celebrating the legend of Saint Ursula. The songs, sung in Italian and Latin, were taken from the mystic Saint Hildegard von Bingen's Visions and Lauds of Saint Ursula. Even with my clumsy Italian and practically non-existent Latin, I picked out the words for flowers, earth, gardens, the elements, and the stars, associated in a narrative of healing through living in balance with the universe. This must have permeated to a much smarter part of my subconscious, because upon viewing the paintings, I couldn't take my eyes off the rows of orderly, botanically specific plants lining the lower edges of several of the enormous canvases. The spacing and compositional arrangement seemed to reinforce the significance of these plants, and I found I recognized many of them immediately. I became entranced by them and spent the next few years identifying them and analyzing what exactly they were doing in these paintings. Vitoria Carpaccio lived from approximately 1460 to 1525, and now his work is one of the shining examples of Venetian narrative painting. He apprenticed in the Bellini workshop in the late 15th century, when they were completing some of the first large-scale oil paintings on canvas in Venice. Carpaccio painted in what Patricia Fortini Brown called the eyewitness style. This style presented legendary, miraculous, mystical, and phenomenal subject matter with the recognizable plausibility and familiar details of everyday reality. Carpaccio's Ursula cycle of paintings includes highly specific details to illustrate the story of the Virgin Princess's travels and eventual martyrdom. Carpaccio used a variety of source materials. For example, he never visited Rome, yet rendered the Castle Sant'Angelo perfectly. Carpaccio used pattern books extensively and had a reputation for his knowledge of illustrated books, classical and medieval texts, musical scores, and an imaginative and thoughtful understanding of religious subject matter. It is safe to say that the carefully planned and composed canvases had no incidental or accidental detail, and in fact can serve as a glimpse into the cultural moment in which Carpaccio lived. Looking at these plants in the paintings then, one cannot help but ask again, why are they there? So first, a bit of technical background. At this time, Venetian painting shifted from egg tempera on panels to oil painting, which gave the benefit of higher pigment load capacity and the ability to use pigments that were chemically incompatible with tempera or fresco binders. Carpaccio's work represents a transition between media, demonstrating the careful brushwork and delicate scale of detail found in tempera, combined with the luminous, saturated coloration of oil paint. Cross-sections show a thin preparatory layer followed by even, precise painting layers, some only a few millimeters thick. Unfortunately, this careful, tender style of painting, combined with the canvas's enormous scale and the humidity fluctuations of Venice, contributes to a difficult conservation state, making these paintings particularly fragile and subject to abrasions and mechanical damage. The canvases have suffered a good deal of pigment loss, especially around the edges, which inconveniently are the places where our plants are concentrated. The pigments are sometimes to blame themselves, as Renaissance painters had no way of knowing their beautiful copper green would oxidize to the brownish green that we see today. Additionally, what we now term the fugitive organic pigments, derived from plant dyes and natural sources, have mostly faded. In this way, a flower that now appears to be a pale blue might once have been a vibrant purple, having lost its vivid reds to time and degradation. Some parts of the images modified by restorers have been scrubbed out intentionally, and other parts were covered with extraneous details unoriginal to Carpaccio's work, such as signatures of the restorers. So how do we know these plants were even part of Carpaccio's original vision and not just the additions of a zealous 18th century gardener? The careful and extensive conservation records kept by the academia show where additions and deletions were made. I also looked at published X-rays and infrareds of the canvases. The imaging reveals nearly unchanged, complete underdrawings. Through correspondence with the brilliant Paolo Spazzani of the Soprintendenza, who took the original X-rays and infrareds in 1984, I learned these plants were definitely part of the original composition, with some details more completely visible in the underdrawings than at the surface today. In my admittedly obsessive comparison of the X-rays to the paintings, I was delighted to discover 2 additional plants in the Arrival in Rome canvas, which are located between the plants labeled D and G and are now covered by an inscription that was added later. Accepting that the plants were intentional, and given Carpaccio's reputation for being a bit bookish, I sought to determine what sources were available to him. He would be familiar with the story of Ursula, which gained a new renewed popularity through the 1475 Venetian republication of Jacobus de Voragine's Golden Legend. Much of Voragine's text about Ursula comes from Hildegard von Bingen, whose visions and lauds of the saint initially drew me to this project. Hildegard was a European authority on Ursula, but she also wrote extensively on herbal medicine, forming the basis of much of medieval and early Renaissance medical knowledge. This knowledge was transmitted through illustrated volumes called Herbals, linking plants with their uses. And as you may have guessed, a huge volume of new herbal manuscripts was emerging in Venice and the surrounding areas at exactly this time. Perhaps the most exciting and revelatory of these herbals was the Roca manuscript, now in the Marciana Library. As a footnote, I'm going to say this is one of those beautiful books that you have access to through the Pratt and Venice program. This volume was compiled between 1415 and 1485 out of the University of Padua, now the site of one of the oldest botanical gardens in Europe. The Roca manuscript was eventually put in the care of the monks of San Giovanni Paulo on the condition that it be shown to anyone who wished to see it. San Giovanni Paulo is the large Dominican church directly adjacent to the Scuola di Sant'Orsola. These are co-located with the Scuola di San Marco, which is today the state of the Civic Hospital in Venice. We can see still extant areas where the monastic gardens might have been located, corresponding with typical monastery ground plans. It is my assertion that this hospital arose from a healing garden complex based in the shared gardens and herbal medicine practiced there from the Renaissance forward. The interest in herbal medicine coming out of Padua and the Veneto was also demonstrated in simple gardens, an emerging trend in garden architecture and planning. Plants were grown specimen style in orderly rows so that students of medicine might tour the gardens to study and identify the plants and make connections among their uses. By determining the connection between the still existent Ursuline order of the Catholic Church and the Scuola di Sant'Orsola in Venice, I learned that the likely original function of the Scuola di Sant'Orsola included the practice of herbal medicine. Devotees of Ursula who wished to pursue a spiritual contemplative life were freed from the constraints of marriage and childbearing by tending to the sick, especially disenfranchised young women and orphans. The botanically specific plants in Carpaccio's cycle of paintings were not simply decoration or pleasant distraction, but can actually be read as a type of herbal manuscript. This collection of medicinal plants can be studied, memorized, and later recognized in nature. These paintings, in conjunction with the other herbal manuscripts kept next door and the garden complex, may have functioned just like the field guides my grandmother and I used to identify unfamiliar plants in my childhood. Sorry, my thing is frozen. There we are. Okay. Barring a lengthy discussion of each of the more than 37 plants I identified in this cycle, I'll briefly explain the methodology for identification and the basis for understanding their historical medicinal uses. Some plants were recognizable from nature, so I was able to identify them on the basis of simple botany. Pigment loss and abrasion often complicated such a straightforward approach, though, and required me to confirm my identifications with botanical illustrations from manuscripts and published sources. Where Carpaccio's images were not immediately recognizable from nature, I examined the translation from plant to illustration to painted image. By comparing a photograph of a modern variety of Roman chamomile with an illustration from the Roca manuscript, we see that both images preserved the pronounced raised yellow centers and white petals, as well as the delicate alternating leaves. In both the manuscript and Carpaccio's depiction, detail is reduced to that which is most essential in identifying the plant. Sometimes a plant is still recognizable by its most significant identifying features, but is substantially altered between nature and Carpaccio's paintings. For instance, the milk thistle in nature has a long stem and distinct foliage. Both Carpaccio and the miniaturist who painted the Roca illustrations emphasized the shapes of the complex leaves, but depicted the thistle body denuded of its apical spines. Carpaccio's painting additionally focuses on the lower calline leaves. The details of Carpaccio's botanical illustration suggest that he combined some observation from nature of locally available species, most likely in the gardens of San Giovanni Paulo, with study from illustrated herbals. This method may account for some of the skewed proportions of the plants, and aberrations that originally might suggest botanical inaccuracy may eventually help to identify the specific published sources Carpaccio consulted. To understand the significance of the plants, I researched their known historical uses. My primary sources included Hildegard von Bingen, plus the Roman naturalist and historian Pliny, and the Greek herbalist Dioscorides. I favored these sources because their availability to Carpaccio was known without question. But I found, as with chamomile, that many of these plants' benefits have been known for centuries and are still used for the same purposes today. I observed certain compositional devices in the paintings that underscore the rows of plants, which seem out of place in the midst of a large battlefield scene. Carpaccio used right triangles to connect the action of the figures with the lower edges, highlighting the plants. This observation and the forcefulness of the compositional devices made me wonder if the plants could not only be read as a field guide to medicinal herbs, but also further elucidate their uses by association. This arrangement of plants is not unprecedented, as in simple gardens, where they were often grouped by the maladies they treated, concentrated in geometric diagrams that related to the body or mathematical or geographical relationships. In the 3 paintings I examined extensively, I noticed most of the primary uses of the plants related to women's health. And further, their location within the narrative even indicated at which point in a woman's life and reproductive cycle they would most likely be used. I was fascinated by what I termed the Virgin Widow sequence, where the Virgin Saint Ursula is juxtaposed with a mourning widow at right. They're connected by 2 symmetrical right triangles, reinforced at the center by triangles highlighting the arrow pointing at Ursula's breast, and at right by a staircase that forms a backdrop for the plants. At the Ursula end, the plants are associated with topics pertinent to younger women and those of childbearing age, including depression, anxiety, menstruation, pregnancy, postpartum and neonatal care, nursing, and cosmetic improvements. Whereas those on the right side in the widow's triangle would address pain management, contraception, miscarriage, and management of menopause and postmenopausal issues, such as mint's efficacy in negating some of the effects of low estrogen in aging women. This arrangement suggests an impressive depth and extent of women's reproductive health knowledge, along with a richly comprehensive understanding of the properties and applications of herbal medicine. The multidisciplinary evidence is strong that Carpaccio and his patrons took a particular interest in capturing accurate botanical detail for specific plants. Carpaccio had many available sources, including botanical illustration manuscripts, and the proximity with the monastic gardens, which were visible from the room he was painting in the spiritual medicinal complex of San Giovanni Paulo and the Scuola di Sant'Orsola. As has been shown, the triangular compositional devices in the paintings draw attention to these plants, which would have been at the eye level of visitors to the Scuola. By identifying the botanical details in the context of their uses in herbal medicine against the backdrop of the history of herbal treatises, this study aims to add another dimension of inquiry to the already symbol-laden Ursula cycle, as well as invite further studies of the abundant botanical imagery appearing in other paintings of the Venetian Renaissance to determine what additional significance they too may carry. Finally, reading botanical illustration as an embedded text that codifies medicinal knowledge within an institution involved in the healing and education of young women and children has allowed for the recognition of a complex socio-political maneuver on the part of Scuola patrons, which enabled members of the Company of St. Ursula to follow their spiritual paths while living out in the world and contributing to society through the practice of herbal medicine. So I would like to thank Professor Diana Gisolfi, everyone at Pratt and Venice and the Department of Art History, along with all those who have helped me in this research, and of course, all of you for being such a lovely audience. I'm happy to have any questions or comments, or if you think of something later, you can always reach out through victoriaboardman.com or find me on social media. Thank you so much.
Grazie, Victoria. That was wonderful. It's so
Thank you.
see all those plants again. It was just such a discovery that Victoria made. One of the chairs subsequent to me got so excited about it that he posted her thesis on our website, the department website, for a while. In any case, it was very original research and it was quite wonderful. So questions for Victoria?
So the first question is from Joe Copta. Could you talk a bit about the original location and configuration of these paintings? They're now in the Accademia. Where were they before this?
Oh, thank you. That's a very good question. So as I said, they were commissioned and created on site in the Scuola di Sant'Orsola. They were in the large communal gathering room where young women came for lessons, fellowship, and the general activities of the Scuola. And they were painted approximately in reverse order from how the narrative of the scene progresses. But one of the most interesting details of it is that where they were placed was kind of high up in the room because there was wood paneling beneath. So all of these young women who were standing there were literally eye to eye with all of these plants while they were in this communal space. So they've been lowered when they were installed in the Accademia so that you can see them all. And that does mean if you want to see them, you have to lean fairly far forward and kind of lean over the rails, but you know, it's still all there.
From Scott, the type of botanical specificity you draw attention to here is also typical of landscape painting and tapestry in the Southern and Northern Renaissance. Do you think the methods you outline here will be useful for understanding the depictions of plants in 15th century European century image making more broadly?
That's another great question. Yes, definitely. I think that this was a trend that was happening increasingly in Northern painting, and it was making its way via the Bellini workshop to Venetian painting at this time. I did get into this a lot more in my thesis, but it's like 300 pages. So one of the really inspirational papers that we read during, I think it's the art history methodology class in the master's program, does specifically analyze the symbolism and the usage of plants as far as their religious significance. But I've not come across very many instances where they actually get into their medicinal uses. At this time when he started these, there's this amazing quote from Cennino Cennini, where he says, just scatter a couple plants across the ground and put some birds above them to indicate spring. So that was really the level of specificity that most people were working on and continued for hundreds of years after that. So in addition to these being fairly new, it then did become a later trend. And I've annoyed everyone I've ever gone to Italy with by literally obsessing about the bottom edges of every single painting and being like, I wonder if this one's herbal medicine too. So I would love to see this kind of research continue, because I think that given that at the time the only medicine was herbal medicine, this can't have been the only series that presented it in such a way.
Good point.
By the way, I'm just reading the questions, so be sure to check the chat room because people are also responding with accolades. So this is from Jesse Sullivan. Great presentation. Do you think there would have been a gendered understanding of the use of these plants when the paintings were unveiled? Who would have recognized the plants in their usage?
That's a great question. Yes, I think this was one of those cases where they were hiding in plain sight. There's knowledge that was passed from women to women, like a lot of the plants were known abortifactants, and they were grouped along with the widow image. The association with death and the ending of a pregnancy is not the kind of thing that a Catholic Scuola would want to, put on the front page, so to speak. However, if you understood everything on this part of the canvas was to do with the end of a pregnancy, everything at this end was a healthy pregnancy, it was a sharing of information among women and among people who cared for children. So yeah, it absolutely was a gendered understanding. And then the other component of it is because the women were the ones administering the care to the community, they had a deeper level of understanding for women's medicine, which they then shared with women in the community.
Cool.
This is from Christina Rosati. Your interesting presentation reminds me that I have often wondered if the Voynich manuscript, still undeciphered, might be written in code because it may be a book of plant-based poisons that was in cipher for protection reasons. A bit outside your presentation, but given your interest in plants, I wonder if you have considered exploring this further. Have you encountered ciphers in connection with plant-based poisons?
I love these questions. Yes, I have thought that a lot about the Voynich manuscript. And I think that one of the most amazing things about the way these manuscripts are organized is that, like Hildegard von Bing's mysticism, they combine both known uses, like the ones from Pliny and Dioscorides, and sort of hypothetical mystical uses, sort of like the idea of aphrodisiacs that might resemble something. So I think there absolutely is information about poisons, but that hasn't been my concentration. But yeah, that's one of those, if you have a wish list and infinite time, that I definitely would like to pursue further.
All right, from Scott. Have any archaeological surveys been undertaken within the monastic grounds?
You guys have the best questions. When the Scuola was excavated, and I can't honestly remember what year, but there was a photograph of it earlier, they did some sort of inspection of the grounds, but because it had been repaved during Napoleonic times, they weren't able to find like original foundations or anything along those lines. One observation I had, though, was that the de Barbary map, which was around 1500, I believe, had a sort of hexagonal shaped garden that's clearly visible from the aerial view. And half of that hexagon is still preserved in the shape between the Scuola and the building next door, where they have a garden. So I think it's one of those places where the ground is good. It may even be the same land where they were growing these plants. But I wasn't able to find any really like detailed archaeology or anything, although if anybody has it, I would love to see about it.
I think we only have time for like one or two more, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to continue to answer in the chat.
Oh yeah, of course.
So this one's from Maria Lowe. I loved your talk. I wanted to ask if any identifiable flower appear in the textiles worn by the figures in the Orsola cycle too.
So this was one of my wish list items on my research. They were much more stylized than what I was able to confidently identify. That was one of those, like, I'd like to get to that eventually points. In this case, because a lot of the illustrations weren't botanically like exactly accurate, I really used the manuscripts and illustrations that would have been available to Carpaccio to confirm my identifications. So I didn't feel completely comfortable without like working with a botanist or something along those lines to start looking at the textiles. However, what I do know about Carpaccio is he literally did nothing by accident. Everything has a meaning, everything has a symbol or a purpose, every color was chosen with care. So it's incredibly likely that he included some of those details in the textiles as well.
Wonderful. We have to move
Yeah.
on. Wonderful. Thank you for all the good questions, everybody. Thank you, Victoria.